Chapter 7, Tender Wings of Desire. Harlan was not at the tavern the next day, and Madeline decided she most definitely did not care if he ever showed up at the Admiral's Arms again. At least that is what she told herself, even as she quickly glanced up whenever someone walked in. The falling feeling in her stomach when she realized that it wasn't him had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that she wanted to see him again. In fact, she barely remembered that his name was Harlan. She most definitely did not remember that his hair was such a light blonde that it almost looked white, and that his eyes were exactly 2 shades darker than the sea. She did not think about any of that. Definitely not about how he had been the tallest man she had ever met, and how it made her wonder how he acted like a sailor on a ship. Did it get too crowded below deck? She did not think about how he was the only sailor she had ever seen who wore glasses. She did not care about any of that. Perhaps he was somewhere far away from her now, and perhaps that momentary flirtation did not have anything to do with her. Kiva wasn't fooled one bit by this act, but Madeline did not care if she were fooled or not, mostly because she insisted that it wasn't an act. She wasn't staring dreamily at the docks in the hopes of catching a glimpse of him. "I am just admiring the view," she said defensively. "Oh, yes," Kiva said with a wink, "because that view changes so very often." "You are unkind," Madeline protested. "I am not," Kiva insisted. "I am being sisterly. Have you ever had a sister before?" That part of the conversation gave her pause. Did she want her new life to include a sister? Would she have to invent some new story for her in order to fit into this new world? How could she possibly explain Victoria to a person such as Kiva? Victoria, a girl who only wanted to marry, and marry well, and be a beautiful lady of a house for the rest of her days? More importantly, how could Madeline explain herself, a woman who'd had that life handed to her on a silver platter, only to throw it all away to work in a tavern by the sea? In her first week, Madeline had been nervous that one day her parents were going to walk into the Admiral's Arms. Any ship that looked even slightly as if it might be carrying the gentry made her run and hide in the back, just in case one of them came in to have a drink before riding off to whatever manor they might be living in. Madeline knew that her fear was ridiculous. She was a solid 2 days' ride from anywhere she would be known, and Mistlethrush by the Sea was one small town in a sea of small towns. Finding her now would be like finding a needle in a haystack. However, a small part of her, a part that she did not want to admit existed, felt a little sad at the notion that her family had already stopped looking for her. Why would this bother her? It made her feel so incredibly silly to care about such a thing, especially knowing that she had been the one to leave. Did that matter? She was the impulsive teenager. She was the runaway bride. Her decision to leave had nothing to do with her love for them. But would her leaving change their love for her? Wasn't a family's love supposed to be eternal? After a week, she wrote a letter. "Dear Mother and Father, I want you to know that I am safe where I am, although I cannot tell you where I am. I wish you well and hope that my sudden leaving did not cause you any undue pain, although I am not so arrogant as to believe that my actions did not cause some distress to the family, and for that I am truly sorry. It was never my intention to hurt anyone, and I hope that I have not hurt anyone now, but I accept that I might have. There's no way that I could explain why I have done what I have done. There's no excuse for what I have done, and for that I apologize. I just want you to know that I am safe, have the potential to be happy, and will never forget the family I love. Please tell Victoria that I hope she will become happy in her life, however that happens, and tell Winston that I trust that he understands. All my love, Madeline." She thought about sending it. She almost did, but instead she tucked it away in the bottom of her traveling bag, now emptied of clothing, and hid it under her small, modest bed. "He does this sometimes, more often than you would think," Kiva said, as Madeline looked longingly out the window at the beginning of her second week of work. Madeline did not know what she was talking about, and told her as much. Kiva rolled her eyes for effect and swatted at her with a towel. "If that is your face when you were lying, You better not try to play cards with the sailors when they're on leave. Perhaps he was out to sea as a sailor. That was his job. Perhaps he only came by once every 6 months, and Madeline met him the night that he was to ship out forever. She did not know. She probably did not care, and she most definitely wasn't thinking of him. Instead, she focused on getting to know the people she was working with, set her sights first on Carson. He did not seem to mind, as he had taken to her with an almost brotherly affection. Madeline enjoyed it because there was parts of him that reminded her of Winston, which were bittersweet. I was never something so fancy as a lord, Carson explained, but my father did better than most in his family. As a banker, he made a decent wage. We did not grow up so bad. How did you end up here? Madeline asked, and she was genuinely curious. That did not seem like the fate of a banker's son, but then again being a barmaid did not seem like the fate of a lord's daughter. Carson rubbed the back of his neck. When my pa died, he did not leave us much, had most of his assets wrapped up. I ended up joining the British Navy, which worked for a while, paid a decent wage, and when I got out, I bought this little place. Decided it was as good a place as any to have a business, get married, have children. Are you married? Madeline had no idea if this was a rude question to ask or not. I was married, he replied. She died. Thank Providence that Kiva came around, and when she did, or else I would have come undone. At that moment, Kiva brought several freshly washed tankards to the bar. Carson felt completely silent, and Madeline quickly looked away from her, lest Kiva become aware that they were discussing her. Of course, being a woman of some intelligence, Kiva wasn't fooled one bit. She looked at Madeline and then at Carson, her eyes narrowing slightly before she moved off to help one customer or another. It is good that you had her when you did, Madeline said quietly in the hopes that Kiva could not hear. Carson just nodded before averting his eyes and going back to work. Later on, Madeline wondered how long Carson had been in love with Kiva, even if he even knew that was the case. By the end of the week, Madeline had most definitely forgotten about Harland, which was why it was such a surprise when she walked out of the Admiral's arms one night and came face to face with him. He was leaning against the very hitching post she had tied Persephone to the first day that she arrived at Mistlethrush by the sea. His arms folded over his chest, he looked at her as if she were the only thing he wanted to see at his particular moment in time. Once again, she felt that dizzy, sick feeling of being both hot and cold at the same time. And as she walked to him, she felt as if her knees were screwed too loose, that she might trip and fall at any moment. If that were to happen, she both desperately wanted him to catch her and also could not stand the idea of him touching her. What was wrong with her? How could something like this happen? Madeline was cautious. Madeline did not know what love was, so how could she know what it meant now? Madeline, he said, his voice like a melody. She would listen to him say it for hours if he would be willing to. I've been looking for you everywhere. No, you haven't, she burst out. You haven't been in 2 weeks. He raised an amused eyebrow. So you've been counting. Madeline wished she could melt into the woods of the docks below her feet. Such was her level of mortification. However, he merely smiled at her reassuringly and walked over to her. I'd like to ask if you'd do me the pleasure of going for a walk with me. It was such a late hour that Madeline wasn't even sure what time it was. She narrowed her eyes. I am not one of those kinds of ladies, she said, although she wasn't too convinced of that fact. Harlan chuckled. It is not that kind of walk. How am I to know that? I barely know you. I've only met you once. And I've only met you once. And yet I haven't been able to stop thinking of you since I've been at sea. Madeline's mouth went dry. She did not know what to say. That is where I was, by the way, he added, at sea. Madeline replied eloquently. She felt like kicking herself after every syllable she spoke to the man. I promise I'll be a complete gentleman. Something in her gave, and she nodded, causing his face to light up in happiness. He offered her the crook of his arm, and she took it, her heart almost exploding with delight and anticipation as her skin touched his. What was wrong with her? Cautious and careful Madeline? Her heart could not stop pounding. She felt dizzy. She felt sick. If Kiva was right and this was love, she thought that it was awful. He led her away from the docks, away from the shouts of drunken sailors and the cooing of certain women of the night. They walked the winding streets of Mistlethrush by the sea, showing Madeline places that she had not yet found the time to see. Work was busy for her, especially because she was so unaccustomed to it, and she had yet to properly explore the town that was her own. "There's Katie's," Harlan said, pointing to a darkened shop that looked like it sold various sweets. "The greatest taffy you've ever eaten." "I've never eaten taffy," Madeline admitted. Her mother could never abide sweets once Madeline and Victoria reached a certain age. Once the thin and pale waifish look had become fashionable, her mother had striven for her girls to match it. Both ladies were lucky in that they were naturally thin, but she still longed for the taste of a peppermint stick every once in a while. "It is a seaside tradition, I suppose. I did not eat it much growing up as a boy, either. I lived too far away." Madeline knew she should have asked him where he grew up. She tried again to place a strange accent. Perhaps he had been gifted with some schooling and then ran off to be a sailor when he grew old enough to realize that there was more to life than what he was living. Madeline did not want to know any more, because Madeline did not want to be asked what she was doing here, or who she had been. At this point, Madeline was sick of who she had been, and it hung over her head like a ghost. If he was surprised at her lack of interest in his life, he did not show it, and instead they walked for a while in silence, enjoying each other's company. Madeline could not help but feel surprised about what she did not exactly know, but once they reached the docks again, she turned to him, her heart bursting with the desire to figure out what was burning in her stomach. "What is this?" she asked him, the words exploding out of her as though she could not hold them in for one moment. "Why is that whenever I'm around you, I feel so alive?" Harlan asked. "Perhaps," she replied. "Something like that. How did you know?" "Because I feel it too." She stopped walking then, and they stood for a long time simply looking at each other. Madeline's heart was pounding so heavily in her chest that she did not think she would be able to breathe. Perhaps she would die like this. It would be terribly romantic, would it not? To be killed by such a longing. They were in that moment, something that Madeline had never experienced but instinctively understood. That terrible and wonderful moment where either of them would take that step, break through the invisible barrier that people constructed around themselves, and stop it all with a kiss. She could do it. She wanted to do it. She wanted him to do it. But at the point of no return, she found herself taking a step back, distancing herself from him. This wasn't her. She wasn't that person. She did not fall in love at first sight. She wasn't the kind of person who eloped or ran off or died for love. That wasn't Madeline. All of this, the connection, the handsome man taking her for a walk, the moment of the kiss, that wasn't who she was, and it never would be. "I am sorry," she said. I can't." Harlan's face crumpled in confusion. "You cannot say that. I've never met a woman like you. We're standing here and we have everything at our fingertips and you're going to walk away?" Her heart was pounding, reaching to the notion that he was attempting to fight for her. He reached out a hand and gently touched her cheek. She leaned into it as though she never wanted him to stop touching her. "I am sorry," she said, taking another step back. "Do not be." There was such a gentleness in his voice that she looked up at him in alarm. He seemed sad, a little frustrated, a little sick himself, and the way he looked in the moonlight was so striking that Madeline ended up closing that distance and pulling him in for a kiss. It was electric. It was everything, and whatever sickness Madeline believed she had from her infatuation with him melted away at the touch of his lips. Her entire body felt as though it were on fire. Her heart beating wildly in her chest. He felt so warm, and his arms circled around her waist to pull her closer. This was the closest that she had ever been to a man, and she would not want it any other way. She felt as if she were a woman on fire, feverish in the best way possible, and something seemed to take over her when he deepened the kiss. She had no idea that it could be like this. All of her thoughts and furtive fantasies, excuse me, about what it might be like had never prepared her for this. Of course, she had tried to imagine it, tried to picture what it would be like kissing a boy, but she had never been able to imagine it feeling quite like this. When she tried to picture kissing Reginald, it had been like kissing the back of her hand. She never imagined that it would feel like fire and ice and ecstasy all rolled together in one. She was breathless when they parted, and as she looked up at him, she saw an entirely new and strange aspect of her future unfold. Unfettered by the life that was expected of her, she was technically unfettered from the expectations of her place in society. No longer did she have to maintain her modesty. On the contrary, she was free to be with whoever she desired, regardless of whether they were going to end up being her husband. Madeline had to admit the idea of it all scared her, for she had grown up with the understanding that lovemaking was entirely in the hands of her future husband, and that it was her duty to submit to him. One night when she was 15, she had playfully discovered a few secret novels that her maid had hidden. They spoke of fire and passion, of wanting, and although the thought of it thrilled Madeline, she was old enough to believe that such a thing could never happen to her. But she had taken comfort in the idea that it existed. Now, as she stood panting and looking upon this man, she realized that if she were so inclined, she could make him her love. "Would you like to come back to my room with me?" she asked boldly. In another world, perhaps he would have cracked a joke. He would have said something or backed away from the feeling, but she watched the want and need in his eyes. She watched the connection that neither of them could really deny, even if they wanted to. "Yes," he told her, and she could hear in his voice that he, beyond a shadow of a doubt, wanted her as much as she wanted him. She reached for his hand, and she took it, feeling the buzz of the connection between them, and she quietly brought him up the stairs to the small apartment above the tavern. Kiva was most likely asleep, so they snuck as quietly as possible down the hall into her room. This was something Madeline had never considered. Although she knew well enough what went on between a man and a woman, for a moment she thought she might swoon in his arms. They kissed again and again, Madeline's heart pounding desperately with the excitement of the feeling. As she lay in his arms, she could not help but feel though she finally belonged somewhere, to someone, and she knew in that moment exactly what it meant to feel love. "Where have you come from?" Harlan murmured into her hair once they were finished with their kisses. She wrapped her arms around him before finally saying it. "A manor house," she replied. He raised his head to study her face, the expression on his own too hard to see in the dark. "Were you a maid?" he asked her, and she shook her head. "I was a lady." Admitting such a thing felt like a great burden that had been removed from her chest. So many people so far had already basically guessed who she was, most likely from her posture and the fact that she had started working at the Admiral's Arms with the softest hands anyone had ever seen. I suppose it did not come as much of a surprise. Perhaps not, but you are here. What happened? Were you orphaned? Madeline turned to look at the ceiling. "No, I just ran away." "Why?" She explained everything to him then, knowing that out of everyone she had met since the day she had walked out of her parents' house, he was the one who deserved to know the most. If they were going to be lovers, she wanted him to know exactly who he was spending his time kissing. She told him about Reginald, about the engagement, about how she had run like a thief in the night from the idea of being the wife of a dude. Harlan listened to all of it with a quiet, contemplative look on his face. She did not know what that meant. "I've terrified you now, haven't I?" He chuckled into the darkness. "No," he replied. "I was just surprised is all. Come here." Harlan pulled her close, and she laid her head on his chest. With his arms around her, she did not feel like her past. She did not feel like much of anything. Kissing a man who wasn't her husband was supposed to imply that she was tainted in some way, as though she had been spoiled for her future husband. Perhaps that might have been true, but as she drifted off to sleep, The only thing she could think was that she felt free. She felt in charge. She felt as though she were finally coming face to face with the wonder of her destiny.